what are the ethics of protesting? Specifically, what I will be talking about in this presentation is what are the ethics of evaluating a protest on a moral and specifically biblical level. To start with, I think we're all in agreement that some protests are morally acceptable and other protests are morally unacceptable. I don't believe there's anyone here who believes across the board, regardless of its cause, all protests are bad. And I don't think there's anyone here who believes that all protests are good. To that end, in my research both in the Bible and outside of it in other resources and some of the books we've been studying in class, I have come up with 3 questions to use in evaluating what makes a protest morally acceptable. The first question that I've developed comes from Kingdom Ethics, and it is the protest of the kingdom, is it in support of the kingdom? Now, Kingdom Ethics gives us 7 marks that we can use to evaluate and see the kingdom of God, and thus we can use these marks in looking at protests. We can look at, does the protest work to save someone? Does it operate in deliverance and salvation? Is the protest in support of justice? Is this protest in support of peace? Is the protest in support of healing? Does the protest restore or build up a community? Is the protest joyful? And does the protest promote the experience of God's presence? Now, to be ethical, a protest doesn't need to do all of these things, but if a protest does none of these things, then odds are that the protest is going to be morally unacceptable to God and to us as Christians. The second question that I've developed in order to evaluate protests is the protest lawful? Now, the reason why this question is important is because we as Christians are told to follow the law. As 1 John 3:4 says, everyone who makes a practice of sinning also practices lawlessness. Sin is lawlessness. Therefore, if a protest goes over the line and becomes unlawful, we as Christians cannot be a part of it. That protest suddenly goes from whatever it was into moral unacceptability. Now, to judge this, we can look at what makes a protest lawful in the United States. For the United States does give sufficient legal grounds and legal allowances for protests. Protest is ingrained into, at the very least, the democracy of the United States. And what the United States says is that when a protest becomes a riot, it becomes illegal. And it defines riot as a public disturbance involving an act of or acts of violence by one or more people, part of an assemblage of 3 or more persons, whose acts shall constitute a clear and present danger of, or shall result in damage or injury to the property of any other person or persons of any individual. Now, that's fancy legal speak that basically just says a protest becomes a riot when it risks individuals outside in the world or other people's property. If the protest doesn't do that, if it is simply on public property, not obstructing any roads, the protest remains legal. But as soon as it risks public or private property or individuals through acts of violence, the protest is deemed unlawful. And at that point, it becomes a morally deplorable action. And we as Christians, if we were part of the protest before this, should leave, or if we see a protest where this is going on, we should not join. The third question I have to determine if a protest is morally acceptable is, what is the purpose of the protest? What is it toward? Now, there are some very clear good things a protest can be toward. An example of it is if it's a protest in support of various liberation theology beliefs, such as protests to free oppressed groups, protests against unjust laws, or protests to unseat corrupt politicians or corrupt leaders. Those would all be good things for protests to be. However, some things for protests to be that would be bad is if the protest was in support of sin. If a protest is supporting a sinful lifestyle, obviously for us as Christians, that makes the protest morally unacceptable, and we should not join or participate in that. Now, that does not necessarily mean we have to counter-protest, although we have legal allowances to counter-protest, but how we combat sin is a question best left to the individual Christian and the individual church, and is something to be weighed on how we can best save people. Oftentimes, the best way to enact salvation towards people is not to get up in their face and counter whatever they are doing and feeling passionate about. It is often much more subtle than that. However, that does not make protesting sin acceptable. It remains unacceptable. Ultimately, with these three questions to evaluate protests, that what is the protest towards, is the protest of the kingdom, and is the protest lawful, these three questions all serve to amplify the point that we need to move as though the kingdom of God is at hand. Now, what does this mean for the specific protests that are very explosive and volatile nowadays? The Black and Brown Lives protests, mask wearing protests, or worship protests. What that means is that these protests should be evaluated based on these criteria. They ultimately are not unique. They don't have special allowances in the eyes of God. They should not have special allowances in the eyes of the church. And if we allow our emotions to get the better of us and jump on these bandwagons, we run the risk of acting like Peter when Jesus was seized and cutting off someone's ear in an attempt to do what he thought was right, not what was right for the kingdom. So, as we evaluate protests, we must be careful to not let our pursuit for righteousness accidentally lead us to sin, or we might end up like Peter cutting off a man's ear. Thank you.